New York City didn't scream. It grinds, chewing up the weak and spitting them out onto the cracked pavement. But inside the cabin of the midnight blue Rolls-Royce Phantom, the chaos of Manhattan was silenced by 2 inches of bulletproof glass and the hum of an engine that cost more than a typical American home. The vehicle didn't just pull up to the VIP curb of St. Sebastian's Medical Center, it annexed the territory. 2 private security contractors in tactical black suits sprang from a trailing SUV. With practiced aggression, they shoved back a cluster of paparazzi and a coughing woman in a wheelchair, carving out a sterile, empty path on the sidewalk. This was the Diamond Wing entrance, a portal where money didn't just buy health, it bought immortality. The rear door of the Phantom opened, and Julian Thorne emerged like a blade drawn from a velvet sheath. At 38, Julian was a terrifying masterpiece of capitalism. He was armored in a bespoke charcoal 3-piece Tom Ford suit that fit his frame with surgical precision. On his left wrist sat a Richard Mille RM 5602, a transparent sapphire machine worth $2 million, ticking away seconds that he billed at a rate of $10,000 an hour. He didn't look at the sky. He didn't look at the hospital. He looked at his phone, his voice a low, lethal baritone that cut through the street noise. "I don't care if the foreclosure puts 300 families on the street, Marcus," Julian said into his headset, his eyes dead and flat like polished obsidian. "The asset is distressed. Trigger the liquidation clause. Bleed the pension fund dry and route the capital to the Cayman accounts. Do it before lunch." He tapped the screen to end the call, effectively ruining hundreds of lives with the same casual indifference one uses to swipe away a spam email. "Babe, wait! The lighting is trash here. Hold my bag." Tiffany Vance stepped out of the car, bringing with her a cloud of cloying vanilla perfume that warred with the city's stench of exhaust. At 24, she was an algorithm's idea of beauty. Fillers, filters, and hair extensions. Despite the mild 60-degree autumn weather, she was draped in a thick Fendi fur coat, clutching a Himalayan Birkin bag made from the hide of an albino crocodile. She paused on the curb, posing with a practiced pout, ignoring the flashing cameras of the paparazzi her publicist had undoubtedly tipped off. "This place has such weird energy, Julian," Tiffany whined, finally lowering her phone after getting the shot. She wrinkled her nose, looking at the hospital entrance as if it were a gaping mouth. "Can we get the VIP concierge to bring me sanitizer? I don't want to touch the door handles. Sickness is like super porous." Julian ignored her complaint. He didn't offer to hold her bag. He didn't offer his arm. He simply checked his watch. He had allotted exactly 45 minutes for this ultrasound. To him, the unborn son in Tiffany's womb wasn't a child. It was a legacy asset, a biological acquisition to ensure the Thorne name survived the inevitable heat death of the universe. Tiffany was merely the vendor. "We are moving," Julian commanded, his voice devoid of warmth. "I have a board meeting at 2. Walk fast." He strode toward the golden revolving doors, his Italian leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the marble. Just 10 feet away, near the edge of the velvet rope, a homeless veteran with matted gray hair sat shivering against a concrete planter, holding a cardboard sign that read, "Hungry. God bless." A police officer was already moving in, baton in hand, to sweep the human debris out of the Billionaire's sightline. Julian didn't even blink. He walked past the suffering man without breaking his stride, his gaze fixed on the golden lobby ahead. Tiffany followed, her red-bottomed Louboutin heels stepping carefully over a crack in the sidewalk, her biggest concern being the potential scuff on a shoe that cost more than the veteran's annual disability check. The golden doors spun, swallowing them into the sanctuary of wealth, sealing them off from the rotting world they ruled but refused to touch. The elevator doors to the 51st floor slid open with a hushed pneumatic sigh, releasing Julian and Tiffany into the Diamond Wing. The transition was absolute. If the street below was a festering wound of the city, this penthouse suite was the sterile bandage woven from silk and denial. Here, the air didn't smell of sickness or antiseptic. It was scented with fresh white Catalia orchids and the rich, dark aroma of single-origin espresso brewing in the kitchenette. A string quartet, positioned discreetly in the corner of the waiting lounge, played a soft, melancholic rendition of Vivaldi, the music floating through the room like expensive perfume. The walls were paneled in warm mahogany, and the floor was a seamless expanse of Italian marble that shone so brightly it seemed to have never known the scuff of a shoe. Julian walked past the concierge desk without acknowledging the two smiling women in blazers who stood up in unison. He went straight to the floor-to-ceiling window, turning his back on the room. Behind him, Tiffany collapsed onto a velvet chaise lounge, letting out a theatrical groan. "My ankles are literally the size of grapefruits, Julian," she complained, her voice grating against the classical music. She reached for a crystal bowl on the low table, plucking a pastel pink macaroon imported from Paris that morning. "And this lighting? It's doing absolutely nothing for my complexion. I feel like a bloated whale." Julian didn't turn around. He stared out at the Manhattan skyline, a jagged jaw of steel and glass biting into the blue sky. From this height, the people down on Fifth Avenue were invisible, reduced to insignificant specks of dust. "Good," he thought. "Dust is where I left them." His reflection in the glass was sharp, predatory. But as he looked past his own image, his mind drifted back to the dark ages of his timeline, the 7-year war. 1. The year the world ended. 2. He could still taste the bile of that winter. The market had turned, his leverage had snapped, and the creditors had descended like vultures picking at a carcass. He remembered the humiliation of the foreclosure notice taped to the front door of their brownstone, the neon orange sticker screaming his failure to the entire neighborhood. He remembered the silence of the empty rooms after the repo men had taken the furniture, leaving only dust bunnies and the echo of his own heavy breathing. And he remembered Sarah. The memory of her was a jagged shard of glass in his gut. In his mind's eye, rewritten by years of bitterness, he saw her standing in the hallway of that empty house. He saw her packing a battered suitcase, her face devoid of pity. "I can't do this anymore, Julian," she had said. That was the line, the epitaph of their marriage. He had interpreted her departure as a financial calculation. She was the fair-weather wife, the woman who loved the dinners at Le Bernardin and the weekends in the Hamptons but couldn't stomach the ramen noodles and the eviction notices. She had looked at him, a broken man with a negative net worth, and decided he was a bad investment. She had walked out the door and into the rain, leaving him to rot. That hatred had been the nuclear fuel rod in his chest. It was the radiation that mutated him from a man into a monster of industry. He had clawed his way back, dollar by bloody dollar, driven by a singular psychotic need to prove her wrong, to prove that she had bet against the wrong horse. "Julian, are you even listening to me?" Tiffany's voice snapped the tether of his memory. Julian blinked, the skyline coming back into focus. He turned slowly, his face a mask of bored indifference. Tiffany was wiping macaroon crumbs from her lips, checking her reflection in her phone screen. He looked at her and felt nothing. No spark, no warmth. She was a transaction, a biological incubator he had leased for 9 months. He ran the calculations in his head for the 1,000th time. The prenuptial agreement was ironclad, drafted by a team of lawyers who specialized in divorce warfare. If the ultrasound today confirmed a male heir, Tiffany would receive the deed to the Tribeca loft and a monthly allowance capped at $50,000, contingent on her silence and compliance. If it was a girl, the terms were less generous. If she became too annoying, the morality clause in the contract allowed him to eject her with a single signature. "I heard you, Tiffany," Julian lied smoothly. "The lighting is fine." A young nurse, looking terrified, approached the seating area carrying a silver tray. On it sat 2 crystal glasses and a green bottle of sparkling water. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the tray down on the marble coffee table. "Mr. Thorne, Ms. Vance," the nurse squeaked. "Your sparkling water." Julian looked down at the bottle. It was Perrier. His eyes narrowed. A muscle in his jaw feathered. It wasn't about the water, it was about the standard. It was about the fact that he was paying $50,000 a month for this membership, and they had served him a beverage he could buy at a gas station. He didn't yell. Men like Julian Thorne didn't raise their voices. They lowered the temperature of the room. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and withdrew a money clip made of platinum. He peeled off a crisp $100 bill. With slow, deliberate movements, he uncapped the Perrier bottle and stuffed the rolled-up bill inside, watching the water fizz and bubble around the paper, ruining it. The nurse stared, her mouth slightly open. Tiffany paused mid-chew. Julian set the bottle back down on the tray with a soft clink. "Perrier is for tourists," Julian whispered, his voice silky and terrifying. "I drink Pellegrino. Take this trash away, go buy the right brand, keep the change." He turned back to the window, dismissing the human being behind him as if she were a malfunctioning appliance, waiting for the doctor to arrive and tell him if he had acquired a son or just another complication. 20 minutes. That was the length of time Julian Thorne had been waiting in the Diamond Wing suite. In his world, 20 minutes was an eternity. It was a quarter of a board meeting. It was the time it took for a market correction to wipe out a small country's GDP. It was approximately $3,300 of his time, evaporated into the orchid-scented air. The obstetrician, a man named Dr. Eris, who charged $15,000 per consultation, was late. Julian stood by the window, his jaw tight. Behind him, Tiffany was now complaining about the replacement water, claiming the bubbles in the Pellegrino felt too aggressive against her tongue. The sound of her voice, combined with the insipid sawing of the string quartet, was beginning to drill a hole directly into Julian's temple. He needed a cigarette. He knew it was forbidden. He didn't care. He needed the sharp bite of nicotine to recalibrate his patience. He strode toward the glass doors leading to the private VIP terrace, a lush garden in the sky designed for moments just like this. He pushed the handle. Locked. A polite laminated sign hung on the other side, temporarily closed for winterizing maintenance. We apologize for the inconvenience. Julian stared at the sign, feeling a vain throb in his forehead. First the water, now the terrace. The service in this 5-star medical resort was disintegrating. "I'm going downstairs," Julian announced, not looking at Tiffany. "But babe, Dr. Eris will be here any second," Tiffany protested, crumbs falling from her lip. "And the paparazzi are still out front. You can't go out there without security." "I'm not using the lobby," Julian muttered. He walked out of the suite, past the terrified nurse, and turned sharply toward the service corridor. He knew the layout of these buildings better than the architects. He owned enough of them. There was always a freight elevator for the staff, the catering carts, and the bodies that didn't make it. It would dump him out at the rear loading dock, a private concrete sanctuary where he could smoke in peace without a camera lens in his face. He found the service elevator, a brushed steel monolith that smelled faintly of industrial cleaner. He pressed the call button. The doors slid open instantly. Julian stepped inside. It was utilitarian, lined with protective padded quilts to prevent gurneys from scratching the walls. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the control panel. Just as he reached for the button marked L for the rear loading dock, his phone buzzed. A notification from his broker flashed red across the screen. Alert. Vanguard Logistics down 12% in pre-market. "Damn it," Julian hissed. His eyes locked onto the screen, his mind racing to calculate the exposure. Distracted, his hand moved on autopilot. He meant to hit the button for the street level. Instead, his knuckle grazed the button below it. B2. The doors closed, sealing him in. The elevator began its descent. It didn't glide like the guest elevators. It dropped. The sensation was heavy, mechanical, a rapid plummet through the gut of the building. 50 floors, 40, 20. The air pressure shifted in his ears. Julian stared at the stock graph, typing a furious email to his CFO. He didn't notice the ride was taking too long. He didn't notice when the digital floor indicator flickered from single digits into the negatives. Ping. The doors rattled and slid open. Julian stepped forward, phone in hand, expecting the cool, crisp air of the autumn street and the gray concrete of a loading dock. He was hit by a wall of heat and smell so visceral it almost made him gag. He stopped dead. He wasn't outside. The scent of orchids and espresso was gone, obliterated by a thick, suffocating cocktail of ammonia, unwashed bodies, stale urine, and the metallic tang of dried blood. The lighting wasn't the warm, golden glow of the penthouse. It was a sickly, humming, fluorescent green that flickered like a dying strobe light. Julian looked up from his phone, his eyes adjusting to the dim, cavernous hallway. This was the basement, the bowels of St. Sebastian's. The walls were painted a peeling institutional beige, scuffed black by years of colliding stretchers. The floor was cracked linoleum, sticky with unknown substances. This was not the hospital on the brochures. This was the place they hid the things the donors didn't want to see. To his left, a row of gurneys lined the hallway, bumper to bumper like a traffic jam of misery. On them lay patients with no names, only wristbands. A man with a hacking cough curled into a fetal position. A woman with bandaged legs moaned softly. A sound of pure, exhausted pain. A sign hung crookedly from the ceiling, one chain broken. Clinical Trials Unit. Phase 1 testing. Authorized personnel only. Julian stood frozen in his Tom Ford suit, a diamond in a sewer. He felt a sudden violent urge to retreat. He turned back to the elevator, jamming his finger against the call button. Nothing happened. The light didn't illuminate. The elevator had moved on, abandoning him. Just perfect, he sneered, wiping his finger on a handkerchief. He turned back to the hallway, looking for a stairwell, his eyes scanning the gloom with the detached superiority of a tourist in a slum. He tried to hold his breath, afraid that breathing this air would infect him with poverty. That was when he saw her. In a waiting area designated by a strip of yellow tape on the floor, sitting on a rusted plastic folding chair, was a figure. She was small, drowning in an oversized heather gray hoodie that was stained with coffee and something darker. She sat with her knees pulled up to her chest, rocking slightly back and forth. Her hands, protruding from the frayed sleeves, were shaking violently. She looked like a piece of refuse left behind by the cleaning crew. A junkie, Julian assumed, a vagrant who had wandered in from the cold to shoot up in the hospital bathroom. He watched her with cold fascination. In the penthouse 50 floors above, his child was being pampered before birth. Here, 50 floors down, a woman was vibrating apart in the shadows. He didn't know who she was. He didn't recognize the curve of her spine or the way she tucked her hair behind her ear. He only saw a problem, a statistic. A ghost haunting the basement of his ivory tower. But as he stared, the woman turned her head slightly toward the light, and the fluorescent bulb buzzed loudly, casting a harsh, unforgiving shadow across her face. Julian took a step forward, not out of kindness, but out of a sudden, chilling sense of familiarity that clawed at the back of his reptile brain. The fluorescent light above the woman's head buzzed with the erratic rhythm of a dying insect, casting her in a flickering, sickly strobe. Julian took one step forward, then another, the heels of his Italian leather shoes clicking against the dirty linoleum like the ticking of a bomb. He wasn't looking at a person anymore. He was looking at a puzzle that his brain refused to solve. The woman was a ruin. She was skeletal, her frame so wasted that the oversized, stained hoodie she wore seemed to be hanging on a wire coat hanger rather than human shoulders. Her hair, which was once a glossy cascade of chestnut silk, was now stringy, greasy, and prematurely streaked with iron gray. It hung in limp curtains around a face that was the color of old parchment, sallow, waxy, and tinged with the unmistakable jaundice yellow of organ failure. Julian squinted, his mind trying to superimpose a memory over this wreckage. He knew the architecture of those cheekbones. He knew the specific arch of that brow. But the context was so violently wrong that he felt a physical wave of vertigo. It took 10 full seconds for the realization to navigate the labyrinth of his denial. No, he thought, his breath catching in his throat. It's impossible. But the eyes, hollowed-out caverns of despair, locked onto his shoes. They tracked up the sharp crease of his charcoal trousers, over the bespoke vest, to his face. And in that split second of eye contact, the ghost became flesh. It was Sarah. His Sarah. The woman who had hosted galas in their brownstone. The woman who used to smell of Chanel No. 5 and rain. The woman whose laughter had once been the soundtrack of his life before the silence of bankruptcy killed the music. Shock hit him first, a cold douse of water, but it was immediately boiled away by a surge of white-hot vindication. She shifted in the plastic chair, scratching at her arm through the thick fabric of her sleeve. The movement was jerky, twitchy, the universal body language of withdrawal. As she adjusted the cuff of her hoodie, the fabric slid up just enough to expose the inside of her left forearm. Julian's eyes zoomed in with the precision of a predator, spotting a limp. Her skin was a battlefield. The pale flesh of her inner arm was a roadmap of destruction. It was covered in a constellation of bruises, some fresh and purple, others fading to a sickly green. But worse were the tracks. Puncture marks. Dozens of them. Some were scabbed over. Others looked inflamed and angry. Collapsed veins formed dark spiderweb lines under the abuse. The diagnosis in Julian's mind was instantaneous and absolute. In America, in a hospital basement, a gaunt woman with track marks meant only one thing: heroin, fentanyl, oxy. The narrative of the last 7 years snapped into place with a terrifying, satisfying clarity. Julian let out a breath he didn't know he was holding, and a cruel, twisted smile touched the corners of his lips. He had spent nearly a decade telling himself a story. Sarah had left him because he was poor. She was a gold digger who had jumped ship the moment the water got into the hull. That story had hurt. It had made him feel inadequate. But this was better. This was validation. She hadn't left him for a richer man. She hadn't left him because he was a failure. She had left him for a needle. She had traded their marriage for a high. She was nothing more than a junkie who had burned her life down to the filter. He wasn't the victim anymore. He was the survivor. He was the king standing on the mountain, looking down at the peasant who had tried to bury him. He stepped fully into the pool of light, his shadow falling over her like a heavy blanket. His polished shoes shone absurdly bright next to her worn-out sneakers, which were held together with duct tape. Sarah? The name wasn't a question. It was an accusation. It was a gavel banging down in a courtroom. The woman in the chair flinched as if he had struck her. She looked up, her eyes widening in pure, unadulterated terror. There was no joy in her recognition, no spark of hope that her husband had come to save her. There was only the mortifying shame of being seen. She scrambled to pull her sleeves down, her fingers fumbling clumsily with the fabric, trying to hide the evidence of her sins. She curled in on herself, making herself small, shrinking away from the towering figure of success that loomed over her. In her panic, she dropped the item she had been clutching in her other hand. It hit the floor with a dull thud. It was a half-eaten plain bagel, stale and hard, wrapped in a napkin that bore the hospital cafeteria logo. It looked like something she had salvaged from a trash tray. Julian looked at the bagel, then back at her hollow face. The disgust in his chest bloomed like a dark flower. She was eating garbage and shooting poison. "I thought you were dead," Julian said, his voice low and vibrating with disdain. "But I see you've been busy." The silence in the basement corridor was heavy, broken only by the distant rhythmic groaning of the ventilation system and the buzzing of the dying fluorescent bulb. Julian Thorne towered over the woman huddled in the plastic chair, his shadow stretching across the dirty floor like a judgment. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice was a silk scarf dipped in kerosene, smooth, expensive, and designed to burn. "I had a picture in my head, Sarah," Julian said, his tone conversational, almost pleasant, which made the cruelty land with more force. "I imagined you on a yacht in the Hamptons, or maybe skiing in Gstaad with some hedge fund manager who had a better liquidity ratio than I did. I imagined you sipping vintage rosé and laughing about the man you left behind in the ruins." He took a step closer, invading her personal space. The smell of stale sweat and antiseptic radiating from her was offensive to his senses, but he breathed it in, fueling his disgust. "But this?" He gestured vaguely at her trembling form and the dirty floor. "This is so much better. You're not a trophy anymore, Sarah. You're a statistic. You're the cautionary tale I tell my interns." Sarah didn't look up. She couldn't. She stared at the tips of his polished Italian shoes. Her shoulders hunched as if expecting a physical blow. She didn't defend herself. She didn't scream that he was wrong or that he didn't understand. She simply sat there, absorbing his venom as if she deserved every drop of it. Her silence was the final confirmation Julian needed. If she had fought back, if she had shown a spark of the fiery woman he once married, he might have hesitated. But this hollow shell? This was an admission of guilt. "Nothing to say?" Julian sneered. "No witty comeback? No apology for walking out the door the day the foreclosure notice went up?" She remained mute, her hands gripping the hem of her stained hoodie until her knuckles turned white. "Pathetic!" Julian spat. He reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit jacket. The movement was sharp, aggressive. He pulled out the platinum money clip again. He looked at the cash, crisp, fresh bills that smelled of ink and power. He peeled off 5 $100 bills, $500. It was less than what he had tipped the valet at dinner the night before. To him, it was lint. He didn't hand it to her. He didn't offer it. He crumpled the bills in his fist, crushing Ben Franklin's face into a tight ball of paper. "You look like you need a fix, Sarah," Julian said, his voice dripping with condescension. "And I'm feeling generous today. Consider this severance pay for the marriage." He tossed the ball of money. It hit her in the chest and fell into her lap, landing next to her shaking hands. "Take it," he commanded. "Go find your dealer. Go shoot up in a bathroom stall. Just do me one favor. Don't tell anyone you used to be Mrs. Julian Thorne. I have a reputation to maintain." Sarah stared at the money in her lap. She didn't touch it. A single tear leaked from her eye, cutting a clean track through the grime on her cheek, but she made no move to wipe it away. Before Julian could deliver his final insult, the heavy steel door marked Clinical Trials Unit swung open with a hydraulic hiss. A woman in a stiff white lab coat stepped out, holding a clipboard. She looked tired, her eyes scanning the waiting area with the detached efficiency of a butcher assessing livestock. She ignored Julian entirely, her gaze locking onto the huddled figure in the chair. "Participant 049? The woman called out, her voice echoing in the hallway. "Sarah Miller, we're ready for the Phase 1 infusion." Sarah's head snapped up. The terror in her eyes shifted to a desperate kind of resolve. She scrambled to grab her canvas tote bag, her movements frantic. "I'm here," Sarah rasped, her voice cracked and dry, unused to speaking. "I'm ready." Julian frowned. Participant? Infusion? The woman in the lab coat didn't look like a doctor healing a patient. She looked like a technician running a diagnostic on a machine. She stepped forward, blocking Sarah's path for a moment, flipping through the pages on her clipboard. "Sarah, we need to go over the waivers one last time before we proceed," the coordinator said, her tone devoid of empathy. Your latest blood work just came back from the lab. Your liver enzymes are critical. They are well below the safety threshold. Sarah stood up, swaying slightly on her feet. It's fine. I signed the waiver. I can do it. You need to understand the reality, Ms. Miller, the coordinator continued, clicking a pen. This is a phase 1 toxicity trial for an unapproved immunosuppressant. Given your current weight and organ function, there's a 40% chance of immediate renal failure upon injection. We could be looking at cardiac arrest within the hour. Julian froze. The words hit him like physical blows. Renal failure, cardiac arrest, toxicity trial. I understand, Sarah whispered, her eyes fixed on the door behind the woman. Is the stipend still valid? The $4,000? Do I get the check today? If you complete the infusion, yes. The check is processed immediately, the coordinator replied, looking bored. But if you go into shock, we reserve the right to withhold the completion bonus. I won't go into shock, Sarah said, a horrifying determination hardening her face. Just give me the drug. Julian stood paralyzed. This wasn't a back alley drug deal. This wasn't addiction. This was a meat grinder. She was selling her body to science, risking death by organ failure for $4,000. The junkie narrative in his head began to fracture, replaced by a confusion so profound it made the room spin. Why? Why would a woman who once wore diamonds risk her life for a sum of money he earned every 12 minutes? Sarah stepped forward, moving toward the death chamber, leaving the ball of crumpled $100 bills sitting on the chair behind her. She didn't want his charity. She was walking into the fire to earn her own blood money. The word stipend hung in the stagnant air of the basement hallway, vibrating with a frequency that shattered Julian Thorne's entire understanding of the situation. Stipend. Junkies didn't ask for stipends. Junkies didn't sign liability waivers. Junkies didn't negotiate the terms of their own death with the bureaucratic precision of a contract lawyer. Julian stood frozen, his mind reeling as if the floor had just tilted 45 degrees. The narrative he had constructed, the comfortable, self-righteous story of Sarah the addict, Sarah the failure, was dissolving like sugar in hot water. This wasn't a woman chasing a high. This was a woman selling her biology piece by piece to a pharmaceutical meat grinder. Sarah took a step toward the heavy steel door, her movements jerky and desperate. She looked like a soldier marching toward a firing squad, fueled only by the promise that her family would get a pension after the bullet hit. Wait, Julian said. The word came out breathless, stripped of its usual command. Sarah didn't stop. She reached for the door handle, her knuckles white. I have to go. I'm late. I said wait! Julian lunged. It wasn't a calculated move, it was a primal reflex. He crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his expensive leather soles skidding slightly on the grime. He reached out and grabbed her upper arm, not the arm with the tracks, but the right one, clad in the thick gray fleece of the hoodie. Let go of me, Sarah cried out, her voice ragged with panic. She twisted violently, trying to wrench herself free from his grip. You don't understand. I need this check today. Are you suicidal? Julian hissed, tightening his hold. He felt the bone beneath the fabric. She was so thin it made him sick. They just told you your liver is failing. You walk in there and you die. Is that the plan? Is this how you check out? It's none of your business, Sarah screamed, a sudden burst of hysterical strength surging through her. She pulled back with everything she had, throwing her entire body weight away from him. Julian held firm, an anchor against her storm. Rip! The sound was sharp and violent, like a gunshot in the confined space. The strap of the worn-out canvas tote bag over Sarah's shoulder couldn't withstand the force of the struggle. The fabric, thinned by years of use and heavy loads, snapped clean off. Time seemed to decelerate. The bag dropped from Sarah's shoulder. It hit the linoleum floor with a heavy, chaotic crash. There was no dull thud of clothes. There was the clatter of hard objects, the rustle of paper, and the slide of plastic. The contents spilled out, fanning across the dirty tiles in a tragic mosaic of a life Julian knew nothing about. Julian looked down, expecting the paraphernalia of addiction. He expected to see syringes, burnt spoons, little baggies of white powder, or perhaps stolen jewelry. He was ready to have his bias confirmed, but there were no drugs. Lying near the toe of his $2,000 shoe was a pair of thick, beige compression socks, the kind worn by nurses or waitresses who stand on their feet for 16 hours a day. Next to them sat a Bible, its leather cover cracked and peeling, the spine broken from overuse, stuffed with yellow sticky notes and prayer cards. Then came the paper trail. A thick, rubber-banded stack of envelopes had slid out, splaying like a deck of cards. The stamps were red and aggressive. Final notice, past due, collection agency, urgent disconnection warning. Julian stared at the debris. It wasn't the kit of a junkie. It was the survival kit of the working poor. It was the inventory of someone drowning in the deep end of the American economy. "No," Sarah whimpered. She dropped to her knees, scrambling to gather the items, her hands shaking so hard she couldn't grasp the papers. "Don't look at it! Don't look!" But Julian couldn't look away. His eyes locked onto a plastic rectangle that had skittered halfway across the hall, landing face up under the buzzing fluorescent light. It was an ID badge attached to a cheap, frayed blue lanyard. Julian stepped past Sarah, ignoring her sob. He crouched down, his immaculate suit trousers straining at the knees, and picked up the badge. It was a visitor pass for St. Sebastian's long-term acute care facility. The photo on the badge showed Sarah, but she looked exhausted, her eyes dark circles even in the grainy print. Below her photo, the text was bold and clear. Primary caregiver, Sarah Miller, access level, 24/7, and below that, the name of the patient she was authorized to visit. Julian read the name. He blinked, thinking it was a hallucination. He read it again. The letters didn't change. Patient, Martha Thorne. The air left Julian's lungs in a rush, as if he had been punched in the solar plexus. The world narrowed down to that plastic card. Martha Thorne, his mother. The mother he hadn't seen in 7 years. The mother he thought was living in a condo in Boca Raton, playing bridge and drinking iced tea with his Aunt Linda. The mother he sent a card to every Christmas, which was always answered by a generic email from his aunt saying, "Mom is doing great, just tired." He looked from the badge to the woman kneeling on the floor. Sarah was clutching the compression socks to her chest, weeping silently, defeated. The dots connected with a terrifying velocity. The track marks, the clinical trials, the selling of plasma, the poverty, the compression socks. She wasn't getting high. She was funding a life support system. "Sarah," Julian whispered, his voice trembling for the first time in a decade. He held the badge up, his hand shaking as violently as hers. "Why is my mother's name on this badge?" The plastic ID badge in Julian's hand felt heavier than the platinum watch on his wrist. It was a cheap, laminated rectangle, scuffed by friction and time, but the name printed on it was an anchor dragging him down into the crushing depths of reality. Martha Thorne. "This is a mistake," Julian said, his voice brittle. He looked from the badge to Sarah, who was still on her knees, frantically shoving unpaid bills back into her ruined bag. "My mother is in Boca Raton. She's living in a condo with Aunt Linda. I pay the maintenance fees. I get emails. She's playing bridge." He was arguing with a piece of plastic, trying to force the world back into the shape he understood. "Sarah!" Julian barked, the panic rising in his throat like bile. "Answer me. Why do you have a caregiver pass for my mother? Is she here visiting?" Sarah didn't look up. She zipped the broken bag shut, hugging it to her chest like a shield. "She's not visiting, Julian," she whispered, the words barely audible over the hum of the ventilation. "She lives here. She's been here for 5 years." "That's a lie," Julian snapped. "Linda sends me updates. She sends me photos." "She sends you old photos," a new voice cut in. It was deep, accented with the lilting cadence of Jamaica, but hardened by decades of witnessing suffering. Julian spun around. Standing near the elevator bank was a nurse he hadn't noticed before. She was an older woman, built like a fortress, wearing scrubs that were clean but faded from countless washings. Her name tag read, Eunice, head nurse LTAC unit. She had been watching the scene unfold, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes filled with a contempt so profound it made Julian flinch. Eunice stepped forward, her rubber-soled shoes silent on the linoleum. She didn't look at Sarah. She looked straight at Julian, dissecting him. She looked at his Tom Ford suit, his Richard Mille watch, and the sneer that was slowly falling off his face. "You're the son," Eunice said. It wasn't a question, it was an indictment. The big shot in the city, the one Sarah talks about when she thinks I'm not listening. "Who are you?" Julian demanded, trying to regain his footing. "And where is my mother?" "Your mother is upstairs on the 3rd floor in the chronic respiratory ward," Eunice said, her voice dripping with acid. "And your Aunt Linda? That woman is a viper. She put your mother in a state-run nursing home in quiet desperation 7 years ago, the week after she convinced Martha to sign over the deed to her house. She liquidated your mother's assets and moved to Florida alone." Julian felt the blood drain from his face. "What?" "Martha had a stroke 3 days after she was admitted. Stress, grief, abandonment. Take your pick," Eunice continued, relentless. "The state facility was going to let her rot. They didn't have the staff to turn her. She was developing sepsis." She pointed a finger at Sarah, who was now standing, trembling, staring at the floor. "That girl there," Eunice said, softening only slightly. "She went down there. She didn't have a car, so she took a Greyhound bus. She found your mother lying in her own filth. She screamed until the police came. She got her transferred here to St. Sebastian's." Julian looked at Sarah. He remembered 7 years ago. He remembered Sarah coming home late, exhausted, looking pale. He had accused her of cheating. He had accused her of not caring about his bankruptcy. "But the insurance," Julian stammered, his mind grasping for logic. "Mom had a policy." "Insurance?" Eunice let out a harsh, dry laugh. "Honey, this is America. The insurance lifetime cap maxed out 3 years ago. Medicare covers the bed and the basics. But your mother needs a high-flow ventilator. She needs specific nutritional feeds because her stomach can't handle the generic sludge. She needs physical therapy so her muscles don't turn into stone." Eunice took a step closer to Julian, invading his personal space, smelling of antiseptic and righteous anger. The out-of-pocket cost for keeping Martha Thorne alive, truly alive, not just breathing, is $6,000 a month. That doesn't include the private room upgrades Sarah insists on paying for, so your mother doesn't have to listen to people dying in the ward next to her. $6,000? Julian blinked. He had spent $6,000 on a bottle of wine at dinner last Tuesday. He had tipped a concierge that much for getting him Hamilton tickets. So she pays? Julian looked at Sarah's ragged hoodie. How? She has nothing. Eunice grabbed Sarah's left arm, the arm Julian had sneered at moments ago, the arm with the bruises, the arm with the tracks. "Show him," Eunice commanded. Sarah tried to pull away, but Eunice was firm. She rolled up the gray sleeve, exposing the roadmap of trauma that Julian had misdiagnosed with such arrogant certainty. "Look at it," Eunice hissed at Julian. "You saw this and you thought junkie, didn't you? You thought she was shooting heroin." Julian didn't answer. His silence was his confession. "These aren't injection marks, you fool," Eunice said, tracing the scarred veins with a gentle finger. "These are extraction marks. She sells her plasma twice a week at the donation center on 10th Avenue. They pay $50 a pop. And when that isn't enough..." Eunice gestured to the heavy steel door of the clinical trials unit behind them. "She signs up for Phase 1 drug trials," Eunice said, her voice lowering to a horrified whisper. "She lets them pump experimental chemicals into her body. She risks kidney failure, liver toxicity, and seizures. For $4,000 a stipend. She sells her own blood and health to buy your mother another month of dignity." The world stopped. Julian stared at the arm. The puncture marks weren't signs of a woman trying to escape reality. They were the battle scars of a woman trying to hold reality together with her bare hands. He looked at Sarah's sallow skin, the yellow tint of her eyes. It wasn't drugs, it was anemia. It was the toll of being bled dry, week after week, year after year. While he was sitting in his penthouse, building an empire fueled by hatred for the wife he thought had abandoned him, she was 50 floors below him, literally poisoning herself to save the mother he had neglected. "You," Julian choked out, the word getting stuck in a throat that felt like it was filled with glass. He looked at the crumpled ball of money, the $500 he had thrown at her, lying on the floor. It looked like trash. It looked like an insult so profound it could never be retracted. Sarah finally looked up. Her eyes were dry now, burnt out. "I didn't want you to know," she said quietly. "I knew you were rebuilding. I knew you were angry. I couldn't let Martha die alone. She's the only mother I ever had." The ego of Julian Thorne. A structure of reinforced steel and arrogance that had taken 7 years to build, didn't just crack, it disintegrated. It collapsed into dust, leaving a scared small man standing in a dirty basement, wearing a suit that suddenly felt like a costume. The clinical coordinator stood in the doorway of the trial room, a gatekeeper to a chemical hell, checking her watch as if she were timing a boiling egg. But Julian Thorne was no longer operating on her schedule. He turned his back on the woman in the white coat. He turned his back on the crumpled bills on the floor. He reached out and seized Sarah's hand. This time, the grip wasn't the punishing clamp of an angry ex-husband. It was the desperate, drowning grasp of a man reaching for a lifeline. His thumb brushed against the calloused, scarred skin of her palm, skin that felt like sandpaper compared to his manicured softness. "Take me to her," Julian commanded. His voice was unrecognizable, stripped of its corporate polish, raw and jagged. "Julian, you can't be up there," Sarah stammered, trying to pull back, her eyes darting to the coordinator. "I have the appointment. If I miss the infusion window, they dock the pay." "Forget the money," Julian roared, the sound echoing off the concrete walls, startling the coordinator into silence. "Take me to my mother." He didn't wait for permission. He pulled Sarah toward the elevator bank, jamming his finger against the button for the 3rd floor. The doors slid shut, sealing them in a metal box that smelled of industrial lemon cleaner. The ascent was agonizingly slow. Julian didn't look at Sarah. He couldn't. He stared at the floor indicator, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Ding. The doors opened onto the 3rd floor, long-term acute care. If the penthouse was heaven and the basement was hell, this was purgatory. A wall of sound hit them first, the rhythmic syncopated beeping of 100 cardiac monitors, the hiss of oxygen tanks, and the low, wet coughing of the forgotten. The air here was heavy, humid, and smelled of cafeteria soup and despair. Julian stepped out, his $2,000 suit instantly marking him as an alien invader. Nurses in blue scrubs hurried past with clipboards, looking exhausted. The hallway was lined with equipment carts and overflow wheelchairs. "This way," Sarah whispered. She took the lead now, her posture shifting. She wasn't the cowering victim anymore. She was entering her domain. She led him past rooms with 4 beds crammed into spaces meant for 2. Julian saw bodies withered by time and neglect, staring at flickering televisions. He saw the grim reality of the American healthcare system when the money runs out. They reached the end of the hall, bed 4B. Julian stopped. The breath left his lungs in a silent rush. Amidst the chaos of the ward, this corner was a sanctuary, a shrine. Lying in the bed, hooked to a ventilator that hissed rhythmically, was Martha Thorne. She was tiny, shrunken by 7 years of immobility, her body barely making a mound under the covers. but she didn't look like the other patients. The scratchy, gray-issued hospital blanket was gone. In its place was a quilt, soft lavender, hand-stitched. The pillowcase was high thread count Egyptian cotton, pristine and white. Martha's skin, usually prone to the paper-thin dryness of the elderly, shone with a faint sheen of expensive moisturizer. Her silver hair wasn't matted against the pillow. It was clean, brushed, and woven into an intricate, dignified braid that rested over her shoulder. She looked like a sleeping queen in a pauper's grave. Julian approached the bed, his legs feeling like lead. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched his mother's cheek. It was soft. She smelled of vanilla and lavender, masking the scent of the ward. She looks... Julian couldn't finish the sentence. "I wash her hair every Tuesday and Friday," Sarah said softly, standing in the shadow of the privacy curtain. "The hospital staff. They try, but they have 40 patients each. They don't have time to braid hair. They don't have time for lotion." Julian's eyes drifted to the bedside table. Next to a small vase containing a single fresh grocery store daisy, there was a thick, spiral-bound notebook. The cover was worn, the corners bent. He picked it up. It was a care log. He opened it to a random page from 3 years ago. Sarah's handwriting, neat and meticulous, filled the lines. November 12th. "Mom seemed restless today. Played Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 21 from my phone. Her heart rate dropped from 98 to 82. She squeezed my hand at the adagio." He flipped forward. January 14th. "The bed sores are healing. I bought that special gel cushion with the plasma money. It's working." She slept through the night. He flipped to last week. October 22nd. "Ventilator filter needs changing. Insurance denied the claim again. Need $400 by Friday or they downgrade her machine. Phase 1 trial starts Thursday. I can make the money." Julian dropped the notebook. It hit the floor with a slap that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet corner. The numbers swirled in his head. 7 years. 2,555 days. While he was sitting in boardrooms, ruthlessly acquiring skyscrapers, drinking scotch, and hating his ex-wife, Sarah was here. She was here, wiping his mother's body. She was here, fighting insurance companies. She was here, playing Mozart. She was here, selling the blood from her own veins to buy a gel cushion so his mother wouldn't suffer. He looked at Sarah. Really looked at her. He saw the exhaustion etched into her bones. He saw the gray in her hair that shouldn't be there at 38. He saw the sacrifice carved into her very flesh. He had called her a gold digger. He had called her a junkie. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't the hero of this story. He wasn't the victim who overcame adversity. He was the villain. He was the monster who had abandoned his family, leaving a woman with nothing to carry the weight of his entire world. Julian Thorne, the billionaire who made grown men tremble, made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. His knees gave out. He collapsed onto the linoleum floor of the indigent ward, right next to Sarah's taped-up sneakers. He buried his face in his hands, the expensive fabric of his suit straining against his heaving shoulders, and for the first time in his adult life, he broke. The sacred silence of the indigent ward, broken only by Julian's jagged breathing and the rhythmic hiss of Martha's ventilator, was shattered by a sound that belonged in a different universe. Click, click, click. The sharp, aggressive staccato of red-bottomed heels striking the linoleum floor echoed down the hallway like gunshots. Julian remained on his knees, his forehead resting against the metal rail of his mother's bed, but the intrusion forced him to stiffen. The air, previously smelling of antiseptic and old lavender, was suddenly assaulted by a cloud of cloying synthetic vanilla perfume, the scent of the diamond wing penthouse, descending 50 floors into the purgatory below. "Julian! Oh my God, seriously!" The voice was shrill, peeling the paint off the walls. Julian slowly lifted his head. He didn't stand up. He just turned his gaze toward the entrance of the partitioned cubicle. Tiffany Vance stood there, framed by the privacy curtain she had rudely swiped aside. She was a vision of absurdity in this landscape of suffering. Her Fendi fur coat looked monstrous under the harsh fluorescent lights, a grotesque display of excess amidst dying people who couldn't afford socks. She was holding her iPhone 15 Pro Max in one hand, the screen glowing with the map of the Find My Friends app, and with the other, she held a silk Hermes handkerchief over her nose and mouth, as if breathing the air in this room would dissolve her fillers. "I have been tracking your dot for 20 minutes, Tiffany complained, her eyes darting around the room with unmasked revulsion. "I thought you were in the VIP lounge, but the app said you were literally underground. Do you know how hard it is to get a signal down here?" She took a step forward, then recoiled as her heel stepped on a discarded medical wrapper. "Ew," she squealed. "Julian, get up! The floor is literally filthy. You are ruining a $5,000 suit. And why is it so hot in here? It smells like old soup and poverty." Julian stared at her. For the first time in their relationship, the filter was off. He didn't see the Instagram model. He didn't see the trophy. He saw a caricature, a hollow plastic shell painted to look like a woman. Tiffany's gaze finally landed on the other figure in the room. Sarah was standing on the other side of the bed, her hands instinctively smoothing the lavender quilt, trying to protect Martha from the noise. She looked terrified, shrinking into her oversized, stained hoodie. Tiffany's eyes narrowed. She lowered the handkerchief, her lip curling into a sneer. "And who is this?" Tiffany pointed a manicured, talon-like fingernail at Sarah. "Is this why you ran off? Did you come down here to give money to some homeless scarecrow?" The word hung in the air. Scarecrow. Tiffany laughed, a cruel, short sound. "Look at her, Julian. She looks like she crawled out of a dumpster. Is she bothering you? Do I need to call security to have her removed?" Julian looked from Tiffany to Sarah. The contrast was violent. On one side stood Tiffany, vibrant, glowing with health, draped in fur, holding a bag worth more than the annual income of every patient on this floor combined. She was beautiful in the way a billboard is beautiful, perfect, polished, and utterly flat. On the other side stood Sarah, gaunt, pale, her hair stringy, wearing clothes held together by hope and duct tape. She was exhausted. She was scarred. But as Julian looked at Sarah, at the way her hand rested gently on his mother's frail shoulder, at the fierce, protective love burning in her sunken eyes, he realized something that altered the chemistry of his soul. Tiffany was the ugliest thing he had ever seen, and Sarah, broken, bleeding, starving Sarah, was radiant. The grief that had paralyzed Julian a moment ago evaporated, replaced by a cold, darker energy. The shark that ruled the boardroom returned, but this time it wasn't swimming for profit. It was swimming for blood. Julian stood up. He rose slowly, unfolding his height until he towered over the room. He brushed the dust from his knees with a deliberate, slow motion. His face was a mask of stone. "Tiffany," Julian said. His voice was quiet, terrifyingly calm. It was the voice he used right before he hostilely took over a company and fired the entire board. "What?" Tiffany rolled her eyes, oblivious to the predator standing in front of her. "Let's go, babe. I need to get out of this." "This scarecrow," Julian interrupted, stepping between Tiffany and Sarah, blocking his ex-wife from the model's view, "is my wife." Tiffany froze. "Excuse me? Your ex-wife? The junkie?" "And that woman in the bed," Julian continued, ignoring her, pointing to the frail figure hooked to the ventilator, "is my mother. The mother you never asked about. The mother you wouldn't visit because nursing homes depress you." "Okay, so?" Tiffany crossed her arms, the Fendi coat rustling. "Why are we having a family reunion in the ghetto ward? This is embarrassing, Julian. People could see us." "You are right," Julian nodded. "It is embarrassing. You are an embarrassment." He stepped closer to her, forcing her to take a step back into the hallway. "You see dirt. You see poverty. You see a scarecrow, Julian whispered, leaning down so his face was inches from hers. I see loyalty. I see sacrifice. I see a woman who sold her own blood to keep my family alive while you were complaining about the brand of sparkling water I bought you. Tiffany's face flushed red. Are you serious? You're choosing her. Look at her. She's a mess. She is a queen, Julian snarled, his composure cracking just enough to let the rage through. And you are a line item I am deleting from the ledger. He pulled out his phone. The child will be provided for, Julian said, his tone turning transactional and icy. Top schools, trust fund, the best medical care. But you are done. The penthouse is closed to you. The credit cards are canceled as of... He checked his Richard Mille watch. 10 seconds ago. You can't do that, Tiffany shrieked, her voice rising an octave. I'm pregnant. The press will eat you alive. Try me. Julian smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Go to the press. Tell them you mocked a dying woman and her caregiver in a charity ward. See how that plays for your brand. Or disappear quietly, take the monthly stipend I offer, and never show your face in my city again. He leaned in for the kill shot. If I see you near my mother or Sarah or this hospital again, I will buy your modeling agency just to fire you. I will buy the building you live in just to evict you. Do you understand? Tiffany opened her mouth, then closed it. The look in Julian's eyes was not human. It was the abyss. She stomped her foot, a petulant child defeated. I hate you. You're insane. She spun around on her red-bottomed heels and stormed down the hallway, the sound of her exit clicking away into silence. Julian watched her go until she turned the corner. Then he signaled to the 2 security guards standing at the nurse's station, the detail that had trailed his Rolls Royce. He pointed at Tiffany's retreating figure and made a cutting motion across his throat. Remove her. The guards nodded and jogged after her. Julian exhaled, the adrenaline draining out of him. He turned back to the small, curtained area where the real wealth was hidden. He turned back to the woman in the stained hoodie who was watching him with wide, disbelief-filled eyes. The silence that rushed into the cubicle after Tiffany's departure was heavier than the noise she had made. It was a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of the room, leaving only the rhythmic whoosh hiss of Martha Thorne's ventilator and the terrifying pounding of Julian's own heart. Julian turned slowly away from the hallway, his chest heaving beneath the bespoke vest. He looked at Sarah. She was standing frozen by the bedside, clutching the rail as if it were the edge of a cliff. She didn't look triumphant. She looked shattered. She looked like a woman who had been holding up the sky for 7 years and was finally, terrifyingly, being allowed to let it fall. Julian walked toward her. He didn't stride with the confidence of a billionaire. He walked with the heavy, dragging steps of a penitent approaching an altar. When he reached her, he didn't try to hug her. He didn't try to kiss her. He did something that the Julian Thorne of yesterday would have found unthinkable. He sank to his knees. He didn't care that the linoleum was sticky with spilled juice and the dust of 1,000 strangers. He didn't care that the knees of his $5,000 charcoal suit were instantly ruined, soaking up the grime of the indigent ward. He lowered himself until he was physically smaller than her, until he was looking up at the woman in the stained, oversized hoodie. He reached out and took her hands. They were cold, rough, and covered in the faint, white scars of needle sticks and hard labor. He held them like they were rare artifacts, more precious than the Himalayan Birkin bag that had just left the room. Sarah, Julian choked out, his voice cracking, splintering into pieces. She tried to pull away, her lip trembling. Julian, get up, you're dirty, I am the poorest man in this room, Julian interrupted, the confession tearing out of his throat. Tears, hot, ugly, unmasked tears, spilled over his eyelids and tracked down his face, dripping onto her scarred knuckles. I have billions in the bank. I have buildings with my name on them, but I have nothing. I am nothing. He pressed his forehead against her hands, weeping openly. The dam of 7 years of resentment, of false narratives, of cold ambition, broke. He realized with a sickening clarity that while he was building a legacy of glass and steel, Sarah had been building a legacy of love and blood. "I'm sorry," he sobbed, the words feeling inadequate, like trying to put out a forest fire with a cup of water. "I'm so sorry." Sarah didn't speak. She slowly extracted one hand from his grip and rested it on his head, her fingers threading through his hair. It was a gesture of absolution he didn't deserve. Julian took a ragged breath. He wiped his face with his sleeve, smearing the tears, and looked up. The grief in his eyes hardened into a diamond-sharp resolve. He couldn't change the past, but he could weaponize the present. He pulled his phone from his pocket. He didn't stand up. He dialed his chief of staff, Marcus. "Thorne," Marcus answered on the first ring. "Marcus, listen to me carefully," Julian commanded, his voice gaining the iron weight of authority, but directed now by a moral compass. "I want the medical transport helicopter at St. Sebastian's immediately, not in an hour, now." "Sir?" Marcus sounded confused. "The meeting with the board—" "Cancel the board." "Cancel everything," Julian snapped. "Arrange a transfer for Martha Thorne to the neurological suite at Mount Sinai. I want the entire East Wing cleared. Get Dr. Hoffman on a plane from Zurich. I don't care what it costs. If he refuses, buy the hospital he works for." He paused, looking at Sarah's arm, at the bruising from the plasma donations and the trial injections. "And Marcus, get a lawyer on the line with the St. Sebastian's Clinical Trials Unit. My wife, Sarah Thorne, has a contract with them. Void it. Pay the breach fee. Offer them a grant, a donation, a bribe. I don't care. But if they ever touch her with a needle again, I will burn their funding to the ground." He hung up the phone and tossed it onto the bed. He looked at the bedside table. There was a plastic cup of applesauce and a plastic spoon. Martha's lunch. Or perhaps Sarah's dinner. Sarah swayed on her feet, her eyelids fluttering. She hadn't eaten the bagel. She had lost the stipend. She was running on fumes. Julian stood up then. He gently guided Sarah to the vinyl visitor's chair, the only chair in the room. He pushed her down gently until she was seated. "Sit," he whispered. He picked up the applesauce and the spoon. He peeled back the foil lid. "Julian, I can feed myself," Sarah whispered weakly, though her hands were shaking too hard to hold the spoon steady. "I know you can," Julian said softly. "You can do everything. You've done everything. But today you rest." He dipped the spoon into the sauce and held it to her lips. It was a reversal of the universe they had lived in. The billionaire, the king of industry, was serving the pauper. Sarah opened her mouth. She took the bite. She swallowed, and a fresh tear rolled down her cheek. Julian fed her the whole cup, spoonful by spoonful, in silence. With every bite, he felt a brick being removed from the wall around his heart. When it was done, he sat on the edge of his mother's bed. He took Martha's frail hand in his right hand, and he took Sarah's scarred hand in his left. He sat there, forming a bridge between the two women who held the only real value in his life. On the monitor, the green line of Martha's heart rate beeped steadily. Beep, beep, beep. It seemed to synchronize with the beating of his own heart. The jagged peaks on the screen smoothed out, stabilizing as if Martha sensed that the war was over. The family was whole. Julian looked at the monitor, then at Sarah, who had leaned her head back against the wall, eyes closed, finally safe. He realized then that he had spent his life chasing assets that depreciated the moment he touched them. But this loyalty, this gritty, ugly, beautiful survival, was the only currency that never lost its value. The sun began to set over New York City, casting long shadows across the room. But for the first time in 7 years, Julian Thorne wasn't afraid of the dark. He was home. True wealth is never found in a bank account. It is found in the quiet, desperate acts of loyalty performed when no one is watching. Julian Thorne believed he was a king because he lived in a penthouse, but he was spiritually bankrupt until he knelt on a dirty basement floor. While he chased status, Sarah sold her own blood to protect the mother he neglected. This story serves as a brutal reminder that a pristine exterior often hides a hollow heart, while a stained hoodie can clothe a queen. Love is the only currency that never depreciates. Now, if you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know which part surprised you the most. Every subscription and comment from you is a huge motivation for us to keep sharing more meaningful stories in life. Thank you so much.